When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart didn't skip from fear of being caught. It skipped because he was about to see those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I tried to snatch the phone from his hands, but he smoothly pulled it back and kept reading. I watched his face change as he read line after line, feeling my life crumble in mere seconds. Yes, now he would learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew any moment now he'd reach that message, the one that would destroy my life. The one that would either explain everything and put a final period on it all, or confuse things even more. My phone suddenly vibrated in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face go pale as he read the sender's name. My husband froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I'm nervous. My nerves mixed with the horror of realizing what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even from the 2 meters separating us. This was exactly what I feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the kind that changes everything forever, and now I didn't know what to do, but let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I tried so desperately to hide for so long, write in the comments what city you're watching this from, and answer this question: have you ever had a secret you tried to hide with all your might, but ended up failing completely? The morning coffee had gone cold again, sitting untouched beside my laptop as I stared at the quarterly reports. 23 years with Henderson and Associates, and I still felt like furniture in my own office. The numbers blurred together as my mind wandered to the breakfast table scene that had become our daily ritual, my husband David absorbed in his tablet, scrolling through stock prices while mechanically chewing his wheat toast. Our daughter Emma, now a sophomore at Northwestern, had called last night to ask about her tuition payment, not about how I was doing. Our son Michael, fresh out of college and living in Chicago, hadn't visited since Christmas. I pushed back from my desk and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. At 47, I felt invisible in my own life. The reflection in the glass showed a woman who had somehow lost herself between soccer carpools, PTA meetings, and climbing the corporate ladder. My auburn hair, professionally styled every 6 weeks, framed a face that David hadn't really looked at in months. Not really looked at, the way he used to when we were young and broke and everything felt possible. The intercom buzzed, startling me from my reverie. Mrs. Anderson, Mr. Patterson wants to see all department heads in conference room A in 10 minutes, Linda's voice announced. Another meeting about cost-cutting measures, no doubt. The company had been struggling since losing the Morrison account last quarter, and rumors of layoffs circulated like wildfire through the cubicles. I gathered my files and headed down the hallway, passing the same beige walls I'd walked past for over 2 decades. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that familiar corporate pallor that made everyone look tired and slightly green. Conference room A was already filling up when I arrived, the usual suspects from marketing, sales, and operations, all wearing the same expression of polite resignation. "Good morning, everyone," came a voice I didn't recognize. I looked up to see a man in his early 50s standing at the head of the table, tall and lean with graying temples and the kind of confident posture that suggested he'd never questioned his place in a room. His navy suit was well-tailored but not flashy, and when he smiled, I noticed it reached his eyes. "I'm James Patterson, your new Vice President of Operations. I know change can be unsettling, but I'm here to work with you, not against you." For the next hour, he outlined his vision for streamlining operations without massive layoffs. But what struck me wasn't his business plan, it was the way he listened when people spoke. Really listened, not the performative nodding that had become standard in corporate meetings. When Sarah from marketing raised concerns about budget cuts affecting her team's morale, he leaned forward and asked follow-up questions. When Tom from sales worried about maintaining client relationships during the transition, he took notes. When it was my turn to present the accounting perspective, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a business meeting for years: genuine attention. His eyes never left my face as I explained the fiscal implications of his proposed changes, and when I finished, he said, "That's exactly the kind of insight we need. Would you mind staying after to discuss some specifics?" The room emptied, leaving just the two of us with the lingering smell of coffee and the soft hum of the air conditioning. He moved to the chair beside mine instead of remaining at the head of the table, and I caught a hint of his cologne, something subtle and expensive. "I've been reviewing departmental files," he said, opening a folder with my name on it. "Your efficiency ratings are consistently in the top 5%. Your cost-saving initiatives last year saved the company nearly $200,000. So I have to ask, why are you still in the same position you held 5 years ago?" The question hit me like cold water. No one had ever asked me that before. Not David, not my previous supervisor, not even myself, really. I felt heat creep up my neck as I struggled for an answer that wouldn't sound like self-pity. "I suppose I've always focused on doing my job well rather than promoting myself," I said finally. He closed the folder and looked at me directly. "Sometimes the best people are the ones who don't realize their own worth. I'd like to change that, if you're interested." As he walked me back to my office, discussing potential new responsibilities and growth opportunities, I felt something stirring that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just professional recognition, though that was intoxicating enough. It was the feeling of being seen, really seen, by someone who had no reason to notice me beyond my quarterly reports. That afternoon, I found myself checking my reflection in the ladies' room mirror more often than usual, wondering if he'd noticed that I'd worn my good blue dress today, the one David used to say brought out my eyes. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of reorganization meetings and late-night project reviews. James had assigned me to lead the efficiency task force, a role that required daily briefings with him in his office. Each morning, I found myself taking extra care with my appearance: a touch more mascara, the pearl earrings my mother had given me, the silk scarf that softened the corporate severity of my blazers. His office was nothing like his predecessor's stuffy museum of golf trophies and motivational posters. James had brought in actual books, business biographies mixed with what looked like literary fiction, and a small jade plant that sat on his windowsill catching the afternoon sun. During our meetings, he had a habit of rolling up his sleeves and loosening his tie, transforming from corporate executive to someone more approachable, more real. "You know," he said one Thursday afternoon as we reviewed budget projections, "I've been in this business for 15 years. And I've rarely seen someone who can spot inefficiencies the way you do. It's like you see patterns others miss entirely." I felt warmth spread through my chest at his words. When was the last time David had complimented my work? He knew I'd gotten a small raise last year, but couldn't remember what project had earned it. "I suppose I've always been detail-oriented," I said, trying to sound modest while internally savoring the recognition. "It's more than that," James continued, leaning back in his chair. "You understand people as well as numbers. That's rare." He paused, studying me with an intensity that made me suddenly aware of my heartbeat. "Are you happy here? I mean, really happy?" The question hung in the air between us like something fragile and dangerous. I could have given him the standard professional response, talked about job satisfaction and career goals and company loyalty. Instead, I found myself saying, "I used to think happiness was overrated. That contentment was enough. And now? Now I'm not sure I know the difference anymore." Something shifted in his expression then, a softening around his eyes that made the space between us feel smaller, more intimate. He stood up and walked around the desk, ostensibly to look at the charts I'd spread across the conference table, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "This projection here," he said, pointing to a graph that showed projected savings over the next quarter. "Walk me through your methodology." I stood beside him, our shoulders nearly touching as I explained the calculations. His questions were thoughtful, engaged, and I found myself animated in a way I hadn't been about work in years. When I gestured toward a particularly complex formula, my hand brushed against his, and neither of us pulled away immediately. "You're brilliant," he said quietly, and the word hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. The late afternoon sun slanted through his office window, casting everything in golden light. The building had grown quiet around us, most people had left for the day, and even Linda had gone home after reminding James about his 7 o'clock dinner reservation. We were alone in a way that felt both accidental and inevitable. "I should probably get going," I said, but made no move toward the door. "David will be wondering where I am." "Will he?" James asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he already knew the answer. I thought about David, probably still at his own office, or if he was home, absorbed in whatever game was on ESPN, dinner forgotten until I walked through the door to handle it. "Probably not," I admitted. James moved closer, close enough that I could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, close enough to notice that his eyes weren't just brown but had flecks of gold in them. "When I was going through my divorce last year," he said, his voice low and careful, "my therapist asked me when I'd last felt truly seen by another person." I couldn't answer her. And now? Now I think I'm beginning to understand what she meant. The moment stretched between us, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. I knew I should step back, should gather my papers and return to my office in my car and my predictable evening routine. Instead, I found myself studying the curve of his mouth, wondering what it would feel like to be kissed by someone who saw me as more than a wife, more than a mother, more than a reliable employee. He lifted his hand to my face, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with a gentleness that made my breath catch. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. I couldn't. The word wouldn't form, wouldn't come, because stopping was the last thing I wanted. Instead, I leaned into his touch, and when he bent his head toward mine, I met him halfway. We kissed. The world tilted on its axis in that moment, everything I thought I knew about myself rearranging into new, frightening configurations. When we finally broke apart, I was trembling, and not from cold. "I should go," I said, but the words came out breathless and uncertain. "Yes," he agreed, but neither of us moved. I drove home in a daze, my lips still tingling from a kiss that had lasted maybe 30 seconds but felt like it had changed everything. The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked different somehow, as if I were seeing them through new eyes. The colonial houses with their perfectly manicured lawns, the SUVs parked in driveways, the whole suburban tableau that had been my world for over 2 decades, it all felt like a movie set, beautiful but artificial. David's car was in the garage when I pulled in, which meant he'd actually made it home before 8 for once. I sat in my car for a few extra minutes, checking my reflection in the rearview mirror, afraid that what had happened in James's office would be written across my face like a scarlet letter. But I looked the same auburn hair, same hazel eyes, same professional makeup applied that morning in this very garage. Only I knew that everything had changed. "There you are," David called from the kitchen as I came through the door. "I was beginning to think you'd been abducted by spreadsheets." It was the kind of joke he'd been making for years, gentle teasing about my work that somehow always made me feel diminished rather than cherished. Tonight, after James had called me brilliant, after he'd looked at me like I was something precious and rare, David's humor felt tone-deaf. "Long day," I said, setting my purse on the counter and moving to the refrigerator to start thinking about dinner. "New projects." He murmured, already turning his attention back to his phone. "Emma called. She needs money for some art supplies. I told her to call you." Of course he had. In David's world, I was the family CFO, handling everything from college expenses to grocery lists to remembering his mother's birthday. When had I become the manager of everyone else's life while losing track of my own? I pulled ingredients from the refrigerator mechanically: chicken breasts, vegetables for a stir-fry, the bag of brown rice David's doctor had recommended for his cholesterol. The same dinner I'd made hundreds of times before, part of the comfortable routine that had once felt like security but now felt like a prison. "How was your day?" I asked, cutting vegetables with perhaps more force than necessary. "Busy. The Peterson account is being difficult about the contract terms. Bob thinks they're going to try to lowball us on the renewal." He didn't look up from his phone as he spoke, scrolling through what looked like golf scores. "Oh, and I might have to go to Phoenix next week. Trade conference. Another business trip, another few days where he'd be gone and I'd hardly notice the difference." The silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of my knife against the cutting board and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I thought about James, the way he'd listened when I spoke, the way his eyes had focused entirely on me during our meetings. The way his hand had felt against my cheek, warm and sure and gentle. The guilt hit me like a physical blow, sharp and unexpected. "David," I started, then stopped. What was I going to say? That I'd kissed another man? That I'd felt more alive in 30 seconds than I had in months of marriage? That I was questioning everything about the life we'd built together? What? He finally looked up from his phone, and I realized I'd been standing there holding a half-chopped onion for who knows how long. "Nothing. Just, how long has it been since we really talked?" He frowned, the kind of expression he got when I brought up what he called feeling stuff. "We talk all the time. We're talking right now. I mean really talked. About what we want, what makes us happy, what we're doing with our lives. Honey, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but we're fine. We have a good life, nice house, kids in college, steady jobs. What more do you want?" What more did I want? The question echoed in my head as I finished preparing dinner, as we ate while watching the evening news, as David fell asleep beside me that night with his back turned toward the wall. What more did I want? I lay awake for hours, replaying every moment in James's office. The way he'd moved closer when he didn't need to. The way he'd said my name like it meant something. The way his lips had felt against mine, tentative at first, then more certain when I didn't pull away. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness brought on by too much stress and too little appreciation at home. I would be professional, distant, careful. I would pretend it never happened and hope he would do the same. But when I walked into the office and saw him coming out of the elevator, when our eyes met across the lobby and he smiled, not his professional smile but something warmer, more intimate, I knew I was lying to myself. "Good morning," he said when I joined him at the elevator bank. "Good morning," I replied, proud of how steady my voice sounded. We rode up in silence, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet of colleagues. It was charged, electric, full of unspoken words and dangerous possibilities. When the elevator stopped at my floor, he said, "Could you stop by my office later? I have some questions about the Morrison account projections." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and stepped out into the hallway. But as the elevator doors closed, I caught a glimpse of his expression in the reflection of the polished metal, and I knew that Morrison account projections were the last thing on his mind. The Morrison account projections turned out to be a thin excuse for what was really a continuation of the conversation we'd started the night before. James's office felt different in the morning light, less intimate but somehow more dangerous, the scene of a crime we hadn't quite committed yet but were circling around like moths drawn to flame. "Close the door," he said when I entered, and something in his tone made it clear this wasn't about business protocol. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the door handle, knowing that closing it would be another step down a path I wasn't sure I was ready to walk. But I closed it anyway, the soft click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet office. We should talk about what happened, he said, leaning against the edge of his desk with his arms crossed. He looked tired, like maybe he'd spent the night awake too, wrestling with the same thoughts that had kept me staring at the ceiling. Maybe we should pretend it didn't happen, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were a lie. You can't unring a bell, can't unfeel a feeling, can't unknow what it's like to be desired by someone who sees you clearly. Could you do that? He asked. Really pretend? I thought about David at breakfast that morning, reading headlines on his tablet while I drank my coffee in silence. I thought about the way he'd kissed my forehead absent-mindedly before leaving for work, the same perfunctory gesture he'd been making for years. I thought about the way James had looked at me yesterday, like I was a mystery worth solving. No, I admitted. I don't think I could. He moved closer then, not touching but close enough that I could smell his cologne again, something that was becoming as familiar as my own perfume. I've been thinking about you all night, he said quietly. About what this means, what we're doing. And what are we doing? The question came out more breathless than I'd intended. I think we're acknowledging that there's something between us. Something real. He paused, studying my face. The question is what we do about it. I knew what the right answer was supposed to be. I was married, he was my supervisor, this was a complication neither of us needed in our professional lives. But standing there in his office with the morning sun streaming through the windows, all I could think about was how long it had been since someone had looked at me the way he was looking at me now. I'm not good at this, I said finally. At whatever this is. I've been married for 24 years. I don't know how to. How to what? How to want something I shouldn't want. He reached out then, his fingers barely grazing mine. Maybe it's not about should or shouldn't. Maybe it's about what makes you feel alive. The word hung between us like a challenge. When was the last time I'd felt truly alive? Not just going through the motions of living, not just checking items off the endless to-do list of a middle-aged woman's life, but actually alive, blood singing, heart racing, every nerve ending awake and aware? I need to know, he said, his voice low and urgent. If this is just a moment of madness, if you're going to regret it tomorrow, tell me now. Because I'm falling for you, and I need to know if I'm falling alone. The honesty in his voice undid something in my chest, some careful construction I'd built over the years to keep myself safe and contained and appropriate. You're not falling alone, I whispered. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his whole face, and I felt answering warmth bloom in my chest. Come here, he said, and this time I didn't hesitate. When he pulled me closer, I let him. When he traced the line of my jaw with his fingertips, I closed my eyes and leaned into his touch. When he whispered my name like a prayer, I opened my eyes and found him watching me with an expression so tender it made my chest ache. I haven't felt this way in years, I confessed. I'd forgotten it was possible. Neither have I, he said. I thought maybe I was broken after the divorce. But with you. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I understood. With him, I felt like myself again, not just David's wife or Emma and Michael's mother or the reliable woman in accounting who never made waves. Just myself, complex and flawed and worthy of being wanted. When he kissed me this time, it was slower, more deliberate. We kissed with the weight of decision behind it, the acknowledgement that we were choosing this moment, choosing each other, choosing to complicate our careful, ordered lives in ways that might change everything. We kissed until my phone buzzed with a text from David asking me to pick up his dry cleaning on my way home, until the world outside James's office intruded with its demands and expectations and responsibilities. But even after I pulled away, even as I straightened my hair and tried to compose my expression into something appropriate for the hallway outside, I carried the taste of him with me, the memory of being held like something precious. Dinner, he said as I gathered my papers. Tomorrow night. Somewhere we can talk without interruption. I should have said no. Should have explained about David's schedule and my responsibilities and all the reasons why dinner was impossible. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Where?" "Giovanni's." 8 o'clock. As I walked back to my office, I felt like I was floating, untethered from the woman I'd been that morning. Tomorrow night felt like both a promise and a threat, a door I could still choose not to walk through. But deep down, I already knew I would be there at 8 o'clock, dressed in something that made me feel beautiful, ready to take another step into whatever this was becoming. Giovanni's was tucked away in the arts district, the kind of place David would never think to look for me. I'd told him I was having dinner with Sarah from marketing, a lie that came easier than it should have. The restaurant was dimly lit with exposed brick walls and candles flickering on small tables, intimate in a way that made every conversation feel like a secret. James was already waiting when I arrived, standing when he saw me approach. I'd changed clothes 3 times before settling on a navy dress I'd bought years ago but never worn, too elegant for the office, too sophisticated for my suburban life. But tonight, under his appreciative gaze, it felt perfect. "You look beautiful," he said, and the simple words sent warmth through me that had nothing to do with the wine he ordered. We talked through dinner about everything except what we were really doing there. He told me about growing up in Boston, about his failed marriage to a woman who'd never understood his ambition. I found myself sharing stories I hadn't thought about in years, my college dreams of travel, the novel I'd started writing in my 20s before life got in the way. "You could still write it," he said, refilling my wine glass. "It's not too late to become who you were meant to be." The words hung between us like a challenge. Who was I meant to be? Certainly not the woman who'd spent the last 20 years making sure everyone else's dreams came true while abandoning her own. As the evening wore on, the restaurant emptied around us. We were the last couple left, lingering over coffee we didn't want because leaving meant making decisions we weren't ready to make. "I should go home," I said, but made no move to gather my purse. "Should you?" he asked, his eyes holding mine across the small table. I thought about David, probably already asleep with the television still on, never wondering where I was or why I was late. I thought about my empty house, my predictable routine, my carefully ordered life that felt more like existence than living. "I don't want to," I whispered. He reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. "Then don't." The drive to his apartment was a blur of city lights and racing heartbeat. I followed his car through streets I didn't recognize, each turn taking me further from my familiar world. His building was modern, all glass and clean lines, so different from our traditional colonial that it felt like entering another universe. His apartment was sparse but warm, books lining the walls and jazz playing softly from hidden speakers. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out below us like a carpet of stars. "I can't offer you promises," he said, standing close enough to touch but not quite touching. "I don't know where this leads." "I don't either," I said. "I just know I don't want it to end." When he kissed me this time, it was different from the stolen moments in his office. This kiss was deliberate, unhurried, full of the certainty that we had time. I felt myself melting into him, 24 years of careful control dissolving like sugar in rain. We spent the night together. I woke before dawn in his bed, my body curved against his warmth, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then reality crashed over me like cold water. I was naked in another man's bed, my wedding ring catching the early light streaming through unfamiliar windows. Panic rose in my throat. What had I done? What kind of woman was I? I'd built my entire identity around being reliable, trustworthy, faithful. Now I was someone who lied to her husband, who spent the night with another man, who'd discovered appetites she'd forgotten she possessed. James stirred beside me, his arm tightening around my waist. "Don't," he murmured against my hair. Don't go wherever your mind is going. But I was already there, already drowning in the magnitude of what I'd done. I have to get home, I said, sitting up and reaching for my clothes scattered across his hardwood floor. Stay, he said, fully awake now. Call in sick. Stay with me today. The temptation was overwhelming. I wanted to disappear into this alternate reality where I was someone's priority, someone's desire, someone's choice. But David would notice if I didn't come home at all. There were limits even to his distraction. I can't, I said, struggling into my dress with shaking hands. I can't just disappear. He watched me dress with an expression I couldn't read. This isn't disappearing, he said quietly. This is becoming visible. But as I drove home through the empty suburban streets, my hair still messed from his fingers, my lips still tender from his kisses, I felt more invisible than ever. I was living a double life now, split between the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming, and I wasn't sure either version was real. David was in the shower when I slipped into our bedroom, and I had just enough time to change into pajamas before he emerged, wrapped in the terry cloth robe I'd given him last Christmas. You're up early, he said, toweling his hair. Couldn't sleep, I said, which was true enough. I'd slept better in James's arms than I had in months, but now I was wide awake with guilt and confusion and the memory of what it felt like to be completely, utterly alive. Coffee's ready, David said, already moving toward the closet to select his daily uniform of khakis and button down. Don't forget Emma's tuition payment is due next week. And just like that, I was back to being the family accountant, the keeper of schedules and obligations. But something fundamental had shifted. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and there was no going back to the woman I'd been yesterday morning. The woman who'd never stayed out all night, who'd never felt her pulse race at the sound of a man's voice, who'd never known what it was like to be truly, desperately wanted. That woman was gone, and I wasn't sure who was taking her place. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and pretending to read the morning paper while David moved through his routine around me. But my mind was miles away, still wrapped in sheets that smelled like James's cologne, still hearing his voice whisper my name in the dark. The guilt was a physical thing, sitting heavy in my chest like something I'd swallowed wrong. Every time David spoke to me asking about his schedule, mentioning weekend plans, I felt like a fraud. How could he not see it? How could he not sense that his wife of 24 years had become a stranger overnight? But David saw only what he expected to see, the reliable woman who managed his life, who kept track of his mother's medications and his dry cleaning and his preference for wheat toast over white. He kissed my forehead on his way out, the same absent gesture he'd made for years, and I wanted to scream at him to really look at me, to notice that I was different, changed, completely undone. Instead, I sat in the silence of our empty house and tried to figure out how to be normal again. At work, I avoided James's floor, took the stairs instead of the elevator, ate lunch at my desk with the door closed. But by 3 o'clock, he was at my office door anyway, looking professional and composed in his charcoal suit. Do you have those Morrison projections ready? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. Of course, I said, rifling through papers with hands that shook slightly. When I handed him the folder, our fingers brushed, and I felt that same electric shock that had started everything. Thank you, he said, his eyes holding mine for a moment too long. Excellent work, as always. After he left, I sat staring at my computer screen without seeing it. Excellent work. As if I were just another employee, as if we hadn't been tangled together 12 hours ago, as if he hadn't whispered things in my ear that made me forget my own name. Maybe that's all it had been to him, a night, a moment, something to scratch an itch before moving on. The thought made me feel hollow and foolish. What had I expected? That one night would change everything, that he'd declare his love and ask me to leave David and start a new life? I'd been married long enough to know that men could compartmentalize in ways that still amazed me. For James, last night might have been just what he'd said, no promises, no expectations, just two adults enjoying each other's company. But for me, it had been a revelation. I'd discovered parts of myself I'd forgotten existed, had remembered what it felt like to be desired not for what I could do or provide, but simply for who I was. That wasn't something I could just forget or file away under temporary lapse in judgment. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart jumped, thinking it might be James. Instead, it was Emma. Dad said you'd transfer the tuition money today. Can you do it before 5? Love you. Even my children saw me as the family banker. When had I become so functional, so useful, so completely defined by my ability to solve other people's problems? I transferred the money and went back to staring at my computer, trying to focus on budget reports that suddenly seemed meaningless. Outside my office window, life went on as normal, people hurrying down sidewalks, cars navigating traffic, the whole ordinary world continuing its ordinary business while I sat inside my glass box feeling like everything had changed. By 5:30, the office had mostly emptied, but I stayed late, afraid to go home and face David's casual indifference, afraid to be alone with my thoughts and the memory of James's hands on my skin. When I finally drove home, I sat in my car in the garage for a long time, staring at the door that led into my house, my life, my carefully constructed reality. Through the kitchen window, I could see David moving around, probably looking for something I'd normally have ready for him. I thought about James in his modern apartment with its city views and jazz music and the bed where he'd made me feel like someone worth wanting. I thought about the choice I was facing, even though I wasn't ready to admit it was a choice. Then I got out of the car and went inside to make dinner, to ask about David's day, to pretend that nothing had changed while everything inside me screamed that nothing would ever be the same. The next week passed in a haze of careful avoidance and stolen glances. I threw myself into work projects, stayed late reviewing budgets that didn't need reviewing, took on extra responsibilities I didn't need to take. Anything to avoid being alone with my thoughts or, worse, being alone with James. But the universe has a way of making avoidance impossible. On Thursday, our CEO announced a company retreat, a weekend team-building exercise at a resort 2 hours outside the city. All department heads were required to attend, which meant 2 days of enforced proximity to the man I was desperately trying to forget. It'll be good for morale, James said during the mandatory planning meeting, his eyes scanning the room but never quite landing on me. Sometimes we need to step outside our comfort zones to see new possibilities. I felt heat creep up my neck at his words. Was he talking about team building, or was there a hidden message meant for me? Everything felt loaded with double meaning now, every innocent comment a potential invitation or warning. The resort was all rustic luxury log cabin aesthetics with 5-star amenities, the kind of place David and I had talked about visiting but never quite managed to book. My room was on the second floor overlooking a lake that reflected the surrounding mountains like a mirror. The first day passed safely in group activities and presentations. I managed to stay in clusters of people, never alone with James, never creating opportunities for private conversation. But that evening, there was a cocktail hour on the terrace, and despite my best efforts, I found myself standing alone by the railing, watching the sun set over the water. Beautiful view, James said, appearing beside me with 2 glasses of wine. Yes, I said, accepting the wine but not looking at him. Very peaceful. We need to talk, he said quietly. No, we don't. But my voice lacked conviction. You've been avoiding me all week. If you regret what happened, just tell me. I'll accept it and we'll go back to being professional colleagues. The word regret hung between us like a challenge. Did I regret it? I regretted the guilt that was eating me alive, regretted the way I jumped every time my phone buzzed, regretted the lies I'd told David about working late when really I'd been sitting in my car in parking lots, trying to decide who I was anymore. But I didn't regret the way James had looked at me like I was precious. I didn't regret discovering that I was still capable of feeling desire, still capable of being desired. I didn't regret learning that there were parts of myself I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten they existed. It's complicated, I said finally. Life is complicated, he replied. That doesn't mean we stop living it. Before I could respond, Sarah from marketing appeared at my elbow, slightly drunk and overly friendly. There you two are. We're starting karaoke in the main lodge. You have to come sing with us. The moment was broken, but as we walked back toward the lodge, James fell into step beside me. Room 237, he said quietly. If you want to finish this conversation. I spent the evening laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, participating in team-building exercises with forced enthusiasm, all while my mind circled around those three numbers, 237. By 11 o'clock, most people had wandered off to their rooms or to the bar for nightcaps. I found myself walking down the second-floor hallway, past room after room of sleeping colleagues, until I stood in front of 237. I raised my hand to knock, then let it fall. Raised it again, hesitated, let it fall. This was insane. I was a married woman, a mother, a respectable member of the community. I didn't sneak around hotel hallways in the middle of the night. But even as I thought it, I was knocking softly on his door. He opened it immediately, as if he'd been waiting by the door. He was still dressed but had loosened his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and the casual intimacy of it made my breath catch. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, stepping back to let me in. I wasn't sure either. I stayed by the door, ready to flee if necessary. His room was identical to mine but felt completely different, charged with possibility and danger. He moved to pour himself a drink from the minibar, then seemed to think better of it. I need you to know, he said, turning to face me, that night meant something to me. You mean something to me. This isn't casual for me. The words I'd been longing to hear also terrified me. Casual I could dismiss as a mistake, a moment of weakness. But meaning? Meaning had implications, required decisions, demanded honesty about what I wanted from my life. I don't know how to do this, I said. I don't know how to want something I can't have. Who says you can't have it? I'm married, James. I have children, a life, responsibilities. I can't just throw it all away for what? What are we doing here? He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, could see the exhaustion in his eyes that matched my own. We're being honest, he said. Maybe for the first time in years, we're being completely honest about what we want. And what do you want? You, he said simply. I want you to leave him. I want you to choose the life that makes you happy instead of the life that makes you safe. The words hit me like a physical blow. Leave David? Leave the house we'd bought together, the life we'd built, the comfortable routine that had sustained us for over 2 decades? It was unthinkable. But standing there in James's hotel room, looking into his eyes, I could almost see it, a different life, a simpler life, one where I wasn't constantly managing everyone else's needs. A life where someone chose me first, where I was the priority instead of the afterthought. I can't, I whispered, but the words felt hollow. You can, he said. People do it every day. They choose happiness over obligation, love over convenience. Is that what this is? Love? He reached out and cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears I didn't realize I was crying. I think it could be. If you'll let it. Before I could respond, before I could think myself out of it again, I was kissing him, pouring all my confusion and longing and terror into the connection between us. This time, I wasn't thinking about David or guilt or consequences. I was thinking only about the way James held me like I was something precious, the way he whispered my name like a prayer. But even in his arms, even lost in the moment, a small voice in my head was already calculating the damage, already wondering how long I could live this double life before something had to give. I woke up in my own room the next morning, having snuck back before dawn like some kind of criminal. My phone was buzzing insistently on the nightstand, and for a panicked moment I thought it might be David, somehow knowing where I'd been and what I'd done. Instead, it was a text from Emma. "Mom, Dad's acting weird. He keeps asking if you're okay, if something's wrong. He seems really worried. Did something happen?" My blood ran cold. David was worried? David, who usually noticed my existence only when it related to his schedule or comfort. What had I done differently? What had given me away? I called him immediately, my heart pounding as the phone rang. "There you are," he said, his voice warm with relief. "I've been trying to reach you since yesterday evening." My phone was on silent for the presentations, I lied. "Is everything okay? I was going to ask you the same thing. You've seemed different lately. Distracted. I thought maybe you were sick or stressed about something." Different. The word echoed in my head like an alarm. If David had noticed something was wrong, what would other people see? My children? My coworkers? How long before someone put the pieces together? "I'm fine," I said, hating how false my voice sounded. "Just tired. You know how these corporate retreats are. Well, hurry home. I missed you." He missed me. 3 simple words that should have filled me with warmth instead felt like a knife twisting in my chest. When was the last time David had missed me? When was the last time he'd called just to hear my voice? The timing was cruel, his sudden attention arriving just as I'd discovered what it felt like to be truly wanted by someone else. It would have been easier if he'd remained oblivious, if I could have continued justifying my behavior by pointing to his neglect. But this version of David, attentive, concerned, loving, made everything infinitely more complicated. I spent the drive home rehearsing explanations I hoped I'd never have to give, practicing facial expressions in the rearview mirror, trying to become the woman I'd been before James had kissed me in his office and changed everything. But as I pulled into our driveway, I saw David waiting at the kitchen window, his face lighting up when he saw my car. He met me at the door with a hug that lasted longer than usual, and I felt my carefully constructed composure crack a little. "I love you," he said into my hair, and the words felt like both a gift and a curse. "I love you too," I replied automatically, the lie sliding out so easily it scared me. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure what love meant anymore. Did I love David? I loved our history, our shared experiences, the comfort of our routine. But was that the same as being in love with him? Or was love what I felt when James looked at me like I was the most fascinating woman in the world? I was drowning in questions I didn't know how to answer, living a life that felt increasingly like a performance. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice was whispering that this couldn't last forever. Something had to give. Someone was going to get hurt. And I had a terrible feeling it was going to be everyone.